already had a chance to talk with several of you prior to services about Feast, and from all the reports I've heard, we've had really outstanding reports and really very good Feast. I've heard good comments from a variety of areas. We, of course, had the opportunity of being at 3, and I'm happy to say that the travel between them was uneventful. That's what you want. You know, it's a nice, boring trip. No excitement. That worked out very well. And we had good trips all the way around. I've talked to several different ones. My sons, one of them was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the other was down in Jamaica, and they both had very positive comments about the feast sites there and the sermons and fellowship and just the whole atmosphere. I talked with folks who went to Pigeon Forge and also to Panama City and Prince Edward Island and Cranbrook and probably anyway several different sites around, and heard very, very good comments all the way around. So that's great. We even had one of our families over in the Dallas area, the Stewarts, went over to France for the feast, and his trip was not totally uneventful. His wife and daughter's suitcase got there, but his didn't until about halfway through the feast. It had taken sort of the sightseeing tour of Europe, evidently, before getting there. And then just right before the feast, I guess, just about the time they were getting ready to leave, they heard that the airline they were supposed to fly over on, the pilots had gone on strike. Well, that's not a good sign. So they got their tickets switched over to another airlines, and while they were over there, I guess they flew American over to Europe, and then to the first connection in Europe, and then they picked up. They had another leg of the trip to fly, and that was on Swiss Air. And while they were over there, they found out Swiss Air was filing for bankruptcy. So that's the friendly skies these days. Not a whole lot by way of announcements or anything. We won't be having Bible study this month. We'll be getting back on schedule in November. I just sort of for your information, I'm going to be gone the early part of November for a week. I'm going to be out in San Diego. We're having a meeting of the Council of Elders out there, so I'll be flying out on Sunday, November the 4th, and getting back on Sunday, November the 11th. I'll get in just in time for our first Spokesman's Club there in Dallas. That will be that Sunday evening. So anyway, we'll start back on the Bible study schedule in November. But anyway, other than that, I don't really have any particular news, and we don't have anything that I know of much by way of local announcement. I see we have maybe a few that aren't back with us yet. I know a little bit of sickness and sinus trouble and allergy difficulties and things like that a few encountered, but overall, I think everything went very, very well. It's good to be back and good to see all of you. You know, at Feast, we look forward to it. We anticipate it. The time, as it approaches, it just seems like, is it ever going to get here? You're waiting and you're waiting and making your various plans, and all the things go on, and then all of a sudden the fall holy days have arrived, and it's the Feast of Trumpets, and it's the Day of Atonement, and boom, we're off. We're down wherever you're going. Have you ever noticed that by the time the afternoon service on the first holy day is over, it's like the feast is halfway gone? I mean, you've waited all this time for it to get here, and then it just zooms by. Where did the time go? And as we're there and you hear the sermons and you visit and you fellowship and you see old friends and you see folks that maybe you hadn't seen in a long time, you get acquainted with new people that you haven't met before, and there is a focus. at the feast. There's an excitement, there is a focus, and at the time, as we approach the end of the feast, and you're all charged up, and we're really focused on this coming year. After all, the Bible tells us one of the main reasons we go to the feast is that we may learn to fear the eternal our God always, to stand in more deep awe and reverence of the great God. So we're all charged up, we're all excited, and then the last service on the last great day, come away home, and immediately you're encountered with all sorts of things. I mean, you got a stack of mail to go through, and there are bills in there, and you got to hurry up and pay those, and you've got to get back to work, and you've probably got a suitcase full of dirty clothes that problem needs to be remedied. All these mundane things, yet they're a part of life. And we are quickly met with these things as we return from the feast. And if we're not real careful, all of the excitement and all of the focus that we had there at the end of the feast can very quickly, our attention can be diverted. And we're caught up in trying to do this and trying to catch up on that and trying to tend to this other. And if we're not careful, we're very quickly back in the, quote, real world. How do you avoid losing the focus that you come away from the feast with? How do you maintain that focus? Because, at the time we're there and you hear the sermons, and we heard Dr. Meredith's concluding sermon there and all of the feast sites, and you're really excited, we're charged up, we've got a vision, we've got a focus, and yet, how do we avoid losing that? How do we avoid getting so caught up in what is around us? Well, I want to call your attention to some things. Let's go back to begin with to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, the Apostle Paul is describing the situation involving ancient Israel. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1, he says, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They did all eat the same spiritual food, did all drink the same spiritual drink, and they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. With many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things." And Paul goes on down through a variety of things. But let's stop and take notice here for a minute. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were focused. They had gone through a period of weeks, months, of tremendous upheaval going on in Egypt. Moses had come back. The people, of course, had been lamenting their situation, their circumstance of being slaves in Egypt. Moses had come back to lead them out. There had been a series of confrontations with Pharaoh. A period of weeks, actually probably a period of months have passed. And now they've come to be delivered. And they're excited. We're told that Israel came out of Egypt with a high hand. They were excited. They were charged up. They'd seen tremendous miracles work. And now, instead of building the treasure cities of Pharaoh, they were going to inherit their own land. There were going to be farms and towns and cities. They'd have their own place, maybe a place in town or a farm out in the country. They were going to inherit a beautiful land. They hadn't seen it, but it had been described to them. It was rich and abundant with life, with valleys and hills, with trees, with fields. It was a wonderful place. A place for flocks and herds, a place to grow crops. And they were excited. Well, they were focused on where they were going. They were leaving Egypt and they were on their way to the Promised Land. So they were clearly focused. But their focus did not remain. Now, Paul said, I don't want you to be ignorant about what happened to them. He says, they were baptized. Maybe not exactly like you were, but they were baptized in the cloud and in the sea. It's the only case I know of people being baptized and staying dry. To be baptized, you're immersed in water. They were immersed in water. They had water on both sides and over the top. See, the cloud covered them over the top, and the Red Sea was on both sides. But it had opened up, you see, and they just sort of walked across. But Paul draws that analogy. He says they were, many ways, he said they went through what you, speaking to the church, have gone through. Baptized. They ate of the spiritual food. They drank of the spiritual drink. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. So here Christ was involved with their lives, and yet they were spiritually fed. They drank spiritually. All these things happened. They started out, but most of them that started out didn't finish up. God was not pleased with them. Why not? Well, Paul emphasizes in verse 6, these things were our examples. On down in verse 11, he said, now all these things happened to them for examples, or the Greek word literally is types. They were types, they were figures, they were illustrations. These things happened unto them for types, and they're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. Wherefore let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. So Paul emphasized that, and as we're going to see here in 1 Corinthians 10, he enumerated 5 problems. 5 specific problems that diverted Israel's attention from what had been their focus. And he said these 5 illustrations that he quoted, the 5 examples that he quoted, he said these are types. They represent a category. They are a type of the same kind of thing that can happen to you and me. They lost their focus. They were diverted in their attention. How did something like that happen? After all they'd gone through, after all they had seen, how did they lose their focus? Well, he said in verse 6, these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be you idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Second problem. First was lust. The second was idolatry. Third, mentioned in verse 8, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed and fell in one day, 23,000. Verse 9 mentions a fourth category. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. And the fifth category, verse 10, neither murmur you, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. These were types. They're written down for our benefit. It wasn't just a matter of ancient history. These things are written down for our benefit. So there are things you and I are to learn from these examples, these illustrations. Now, let's go back through the original accounts and let's see what each of these involve. The first, he says, don't lust like some of them lusted. That's mentioned in Numbers 11, that particular account. In Numbers 11 and verse 1, we learn that when the people complained, it displeased the Eternal. The Eternal heard it. You know, God really doesn't like to hear a lot of just negative whining and belly aching and complaining. That's displeased the Lord. He heard it. He was listening. His anger was kindled. And the fire of the Eternal burned among them and consumed them in the uttermost parts of the camp. People cried unto Moses. Moses prayed unto the Lord, and the fire was quenched. Verse 4, the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and they said, Who will give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish, which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our soul is dried away, and there's nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. Manna was as coriander seed, and the color of it was the color of bdellium. The people went about, and they gathered it, and they ground it in mills, they beat it in a mortar, or they baked it in pans and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. Now Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Eternal was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, Why have you afflicted your servant? What have I done to not find favor in your sight? You should lay the burden of all this people upon me. Moses, in effect, told God, he said, Lord, I thought you liked me. What in the world did I ever do to deserve all this? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them? Am I their mother, their father? You tell me to carry them in your bosom as a nursing father bears a sucking child unto the land you swore to their fathers? You mean I've got to carry this big bunch of babies and just sort of rock them in my arms and haul them all the way there? Moses was feeling a little frustrated himself at that point. Where am I going to have flesh to give all these people? Now here they are, they're complaining. They were complaining, they were tired of manna. Now you could do a lot of things with manna. You could beat it, you could bake it, you could grind it, you could probably even eat it raw. Just about anything you could think of, you could do it to the manna. But they were dissatisfied with what they had, and they began remembering the good old days. Now, their memory of the good old days was pretty selective. They didn't remember having to make bricks without straw. They remembered all the abundance of fish. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the garlic. And they began to complain and how rough life was. And their whole focus was they wanted something else to eat that God hadn't given them. They wanted flesh to eat. And they whined and they complained. God told them in verse 19 through Moses, you shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, even a whole month until it's coming out at your nostrils. God says, I'm going to give you a belly full. You're going to have it coming. You're going to have it so much of it, it's going to be coming out, and it'll be loathsome unto you because you've despised the Lord which is among you, and you've wept before Him, saying, Why did we come out of Egypt? Moses said, Well, Lord, where in the world are we going to get we're going to get food to just wear them out on it? Where are we going to get a month worth of something like this? And so anyway, God's plan, verse 31, there went forth a wind from the Lord and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side round about the camp. And it was 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. I mean, it was it wasn't just a few quail. It wasn't just a covey or two. I mean, quail covered the earth. And the people stood up all day and all that night and all the next day, and they gathered the quail. And he that gathered least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp, while the flesh was yet in their teeth. Before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled upon the people. Now, if you want to understand a little bit of why that was, we're told back in Psalm 78, an account of this. Psalm 78, verse 24. God had rained down manna upon them to eat, had given them the corn of heaven, Man did eat angels' food. He sent them food to the full. Now, man wasn't satisfied with angels' food. So God caused an east wind to blow, and by his power he brought in the south wind, rained flesh upon them as dust, feathered fowl like as the sand of the sea, and let it fall in the midst of their camp round about their habitations. They did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust while the meat was yet in their mouths. The wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest of them and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still and believed not for his wondrous works. Now there are other places as well here in the Psalms where it talks about what God had done and why he had allowed them these things, why he had done some of this. And of course, part of what you find is that as you put other accounts together, is that the people evidenced a greedy attitude. One account mentions that they were devouring this food. They hadn't even stopped to properly bleed it. They didn't properly cook it. Some of it was raw, and God was absolutely disgusted. Here were a group of people that God had worked miracles for, and yet what was their attitude? They were totally self-focused. We're told in Psalm 106. In Psalm 106, verse 14 or verse 13, they soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel. They lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert. He gave them their request, but sent leanness unto their soul. He gave them their request. He allowed them to have what they thought they wanted, but there were consequences. There were consequences that came from it. And those consequences, those consequences weren't good. He gave them their request, but he gave them their own desire. But he sent leanness to their soul. There was a spiritual. They may have been physically nourished, but they became spiritually malnourished, as it were. God allowed them to have what they wanted, and what they wanted was not the spiritual, it was the physical. And there were lessons here. Here were people who were driven by a lustful, a covetous desire. In other words, it was a purely materialistic focus. Israel lost their focus on God and God's promises because their focus was purely materialistic. It was based on the appetites of the flesh. And all they could think of was filling their own appetites, and they weren't satisfied with what God had. They were materialistic in their focus. So the first type of thing that serves to get people off the track is to become focused upon and obsessed with material things. We live in a physical realm. We are physical. We're surrounded by physical things. It's easy for us to get worked up and excited about physical. About more of this and more of that, and a bigger this and a bigger that. That's the natural man. Israel of old, the first type, the first category, first type of problem is a problem that involves being obsessed with the material, with the physical. Looking upon the spiritual as having little value and being totally focused on the physical. Now, the second thing that Moses mentioned, or that Paul mentioned in 1 Corinthians 10, was the first thing had to do with lust. They were estranged by their lust. Secondly, was that neither be idolaters, as were some of them. They sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Now, it mentions that. Paul is paraphrasing from Exodus chapter 32. You read the account, picking it up in Exodus 32:1. Moses was up in the mountain receiving the tables of the law. And in Exodus 32:1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and they said unto him, Up, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this man Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Aaron told them to break off the golden earrings and bring them to him. So the people broke off the golden earrings, and they brought them to Aaron. He received them at their hand, and he fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made a molten calf. And they said, These be your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation, and he said, Tomorrow is a feast to the eternal. Now, you know, in the people's mind, they were not forsaking the worship of God. They were going to be celebrating a feast to the eternal, a feast to Yahweh. They weren't worshiping Baal, right? They weren't worshiping this or that. They were worshiping the Lord. They were worshiping the God of Israel, Yahweh. That's what they said. But they were worshiping Him the way they chose to do it. You and I can't worship God on our terms, as though God would be satisfied with just whatever crumbs we choose to throw it. That's not acceptable to God. You can't set the pattern and go out and say, well, you know, that's a neat little pagan custom, and that's sort of neat. I like that other one, and we'll just sort of put them all together, and that'll be good. No, God said, you remember Christ made the emphasize to the woman at the well in Samaria, those that worship God. Here's what acceptable worship involves. Those that worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth. In spirit and in truth. That's what God accepts, worship that is in spirit and in truth. In spirit, coming from the heart. You know, you really mean it. That's your intent. It comes from the heart, and it's also in truth. It comes according to the pattern that God has set. So we have to worship God from the heart, and we have to worship Him according to the pattern that He has established. Now, the people weren't worshiping God according to the pattern He had established. He had just a matter of a few weeks earlier had given them the Ten Commandments. He had explained to them what was the acceptable and what was the unacceptable pattern. The allure of idolatry has always been the attraction that man has for that which can be seen and touched and handled. Somehow what we can see, what we can touch, seems more real. And when you contrast that with the invisible God who must be seen through faith, well, it seems sort of far off and remote. These people weren't seeing anything. In fact, they weren't even seeing Moses. You know, sometimes we look at it and we think, well, idolatry, you know, that may have been a problem a long time ago, but that's certainly not a problem for us. Well, what is worship? Worship involves devotion, it involves allegiance, it involves loyalty, it involves love. What do people give their loyalty, their devotion, their allegiance to? Very few give it to the true God. They may give it to their job. They may give it to the acquisition of money. They may give it to the acquisition of things. You know, you can tell when you're messing with what people hold near and dear. You get them stirred up. You look around. A lot of people. They pay lip service to religion, but they really don't want anything interfering with their life. And they don't want to be told that they're wrong and they're going to have to change. Israel wanted to worship God, but they wanted to worship God the way they chose to do it. And they remembered these various customs from Egypt, and they didn't see why they couldn't worship God that way. And so they had set up an idol. Aaron built the idol. Said, tomorrow's a feast of the eternal. Verse 6, they rose up early on the morning, offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, they weren't going to be playing volleyball or tiddlywinks or checkers. In fact, if you come on down a little bit further in the account, we're told that Moses, verse 25, saw that the people were naked. Oh, so that's what they've been playing. In fact, verse 19 says, when they came near to the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. They were whooping it up, dancing around the calf. They had sat down to eat and drink all right, and they rose up to play. Well, they were having a real orgy. They were really getting in the mood by the time Moses got back down. In fact, Moses is on his way down the mountain. You know, God told him, he said, you better hurry up and get down there. Your people that you brought forth out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. God really wasn't wanting to claim credit for them at that point. Always strikes me as funny, and I think, you know, it's very understandable. Your people that you brought. So they've turned away quickly out of the way. Well, see, God had already seen it. God could see what they were doing from on top of the mountain. Moses couldn't see it until he got down. Moses, when he heard about it, was sure that it couldn't be quite as bad as what it was being described. He said, "Oh Lord, you know, don't be upset, and please don't let your anger wax hot, and you know, everything will be okay." Moses got down the mountain and he couldn't believe it. He threw the tables down, shattered the tables of stone, grabbed the golden calf, put it in the fire, burned it up, ground it to powder, put it in the water, and made them drink it. Then he started in on Aaron. And he said unto Aaron, verse 21, "What did this people do to you, that you brought so great a sin upon them?" And Aaron, who by this point anyway had picked up on the fact that his brother was pretty upset. You know, the man Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. He didn't say a whole lot very often, but when he did say it, he really said it. And this was one of those times. And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot." You know, this people, they're just set on mischief. You know, they just, that's the way they are. Now here, I'll tell you what happened. They told me, they said, "Make us gods to go before us." We don't know what happened to Moses. And I said, "Well, if you got any gold, break it off and give it to me." So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and this calf came out. You know, it's amazing. You can tell the truth, just skip over a couple of details. You ever done that? Somebody, you know, you're really on the spot, and you know they're mad, and what you say is right. You just sort of skip a couple of details. Aaron said, they gave me the gold. That was right. I threw it in the fire. That was right. The calf came out. Well, that was right, but there was a little bit in between. He sort of helped the calf come out. He managed to leave that detail out. You see, the allure, the attraction, the enticement of idolatry. And the trouble with idolatry is it doesn't just, you know, they say, well, worshiping this image, worshiping something you can see. But you see, the worship of something else, introducing false patterns into worship, inevitably leads into other problems. The people started out, they were going to have a feast to God. They were going to offer sacrifices. They just wanted something they could see. And what they thought of was something, you know, sort of like what they used to use in Egypt. Well, they sat down to eat and drink, but by the time the eating and drinking was over, they got to remembering what some of the folks in Egypt used to do. You see, idolatry always coarsens and corrupts. It leads into a superstitious approach to appeasing God rather than really serving God and having a relationship with Him. How do you have a relationship with a golden calf or a statue or a picture? You can try to appease it. You can go through all sorts of superstitious actions, but you don't have a relationship. But you see, man has this penchant, as it were, for what can be seen. Somehow that seems more real. You read in Hebrews 11 of men and women of faith to whom the invisible God was more real than what they saw. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He saw, spiritually, he saw God. And God was more real to him than Pharaoh was. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we're told that they looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. They saw through spiritual eyes what others didn't see. Idolatry, that allure of what we can see. Now, we think sometimes in our modern society, in our modern culture, that what does idolatry have to do with us? Notice back in Isaiah chapter 2. In verse 5 it says, O house of Jacob, come you, let us walk in the light of the Lord. You have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob. They're replenished from the east. It's amazing the hold that Eastern mystic religions have in this country, and even bits and pieces that are imported into all sorts of things. Verse 7, their land is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end to their treasures. Their land also is full of horses, neither is there any end to their chariots. Get on the 635 loop in Dallas and you'll get the real impact of this verse. Neither is there any end of their chariots. Boy, just stretch, 3 or 4 lanes wide as far as the eye can see. And that's only the direction you're going. Look over the next end, and they're the same way. Just incredible. So full of material things, silver and gold. Their land, verse 8, also is full of idols. They worship the works of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. See, the essence of idolatry is you're worshiping, you're giving allegiance, devotion, loyalty to what really is something you've made or that others have made. Worship of the true God is worshiping the one that made us. And yet people worship the works of their own hands. And it doesn't have to be just simply an image or a picture or a statue sitting up somewhere. People worship the works of their own hands, what their own fingers have made. They worship technology. They worship gadgets. They worship automobiles. They worship, just the whole gamut of things. That's what their efforts and their energies go into. That's what they give up and sacrifice for. If you give up and you sacrifice and you give a great devotion to something, that's what you're worshiping. So verse 10 goes on and describes, you see, the events of the coming day of the Lord. Enter into the rock, hide in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of His majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled. The haughtiness of men shall be bowed down. The Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. The day of the Lord shall be upon every one that is proud and lofty, and upon every one that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. The cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, all the oaks of Bashan, upon the high mountains and all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower, every fence wall. The loftiness of man, verse 17, shall be bowed down. The haughtiness of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day, and the idols He shall utterly abolish. They'll go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of His majesty. When He arises to shake terribly the earth, that great blinding light, as it begins to appear, and they're going to be absolutely frightened. And if they can find a place to hide, they will. The man in that day will cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they've made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats. Well, they'll be throwing that stuff down, trying to get out of the way, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks for fear of the Lord and for the glory of His majesty when He arises to shake terribly the earth. That's what it's going to take to break the hold, to break the allure of idolatry. That was the second type of sin that Paul outlined. He said many of the Israelites lost their focus as a result of their lust. Their focus purely on the physical and on satiating the physical appetites. Also, the matter of idolatry, the allure, the attraction of what they could see. Then Paul went on to state in 1 Corinthians 10, the third type of problem, neither commit fornication, as some of them did. Fell in one day, 23,000. Now you read about that back in Numbers chapter 25. In Numbers 25, we pick up the account of Israel, the fornication with the Moabite women. Now the backdrop to that comes on back about in chapter 22. In chapter 22, we find that Balak, who was the king of the Moabites, saw the Israelites arrive, and he saw what had happened to others that they had encountered. And Balak decided he was going to go for the main man. He got together people, some of his princes, and he sent them up, made a journey of 200 or 300 miles up on the Euphrates to Pethor. Find a man by the name of Balaam. And Balaam was the chief pagan prophet of the ancient world. He was the great one. And there's a lot of interesting things you can come up with about Balaam and the reality that he was a successor of Nimrod in that sense. Well, Balaam was a man that liked money. And you've heard money talks. Well, Balaam spoke the language. He liked that. We're told in the New Testament about Balaam that he loved the wages of unrighteousness. Because you see, while they came to him and said, "We've got a job for you, Balaam. We want you to come down here and put a curse on Israel," God came to Balaam in a dream that night, and he said, "Balaam, don't go. I'm not going to let you put a curse on Israel." Well, Balaam really wanted to go, and you can read the story back in Numbers. You know, sometimes when somebody really wants to do something, God says what He wants you to do, and you really want to do it. Well, sometimes God says, "Okay, go do it, buddy." Balaam, you remember the story, of course. Even Balaam's donkey had more sense than Balaam did. When the angel blocked the way, the donkey stopped. When God blocked the way, Balaam just looked for a way around it. And then he got mad at the donkey, who was smarter than him. Balaam got so frustrated he started beating on the donkey because the donkey wouldn't go. And obviously the donkey could see something Balaam couldn't see. He saw a big angel standing there with a drawn sword blocking the way, which sort of gives you the idea that the donkey had more spiritual perception than Balaam did. I mean, this was the sort of the thing. And Balaam got so mad, he was beating on his donkey, and finally the old donkey looked at him and he said, "What are you beating me for?" And Balaam was so frustrated, he answered the donkey. He said, "Well, you won't go where I want you to go." And the donkey said, "Now, hadn't I been your donkey for a long time and hadn't always been a good donkey?" Balaam said, "Yeah, you've been a pretty good donkey." And so you go through and you read the accounts, and did Balaam get the point from the donkey? No. He managed to get on down there, and he got there, and God still told him, "Balaam, I'm not going to let you put a curse on these people." Now, it's interesting because Balaam really did want the reward. And Balaam was sort of a slick fellow. He got to thinking. And it's summarized for us. You can get the details of the account in Numbers, but let me read you the summary sort of in one verse here in Revelation chapter 2, where the summary is given. Revelation 2:14, when Christ was writing to the church at Pergamos, He said, "I have a few things against you, because you have there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam." Now you want to find out what Balaam's doctrine is. Here it was. "Who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit fornication." A woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the congregation. He just comes marching right on into camp with his woman in tow and goes right on into the tent. Now, Aaron's grandson, Phineas, was a sort of a quick-tempered fella. You get the idea. He jumped up from where they were sitting, rose up from among the congregation, took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust them both through. Boy, he was fired up. He skewered them to the ground like a shish kebab. The plague was staged. In fact, 24,000 died in the plague. Paul says that 23,000 of them died in one day. Evidently, 1,000 others had been executed maybe the day before, were the heads that were hung up before the Lord, and some of the ringleaders of this thing. But God struck this plague, and God made a covenant with Phineas, who certainly evidenced zeal. He was zealous. He was a man that was fired up and ready to take a stand. And the covenant was that the priesthood that would come through Aaron would continue through the family of Phineas, through Phineas' descendants on down. Now here we find the allure, the enticement of immorality. You know, the first thing is they went where they shouldn't have gone. See, the Moabite women said, "Hey, come on down. We're having a party." So they came down to eat, and before they finished, they bowed down to their God. Then they sort of got caught up in the excitement of the moment. Immorality was common in terms of pagan connection with pagan religion. So here was the allure of immorality. And it was enticement. It was alluring. People first went where they weren't supposed to go, hanging around people they should have left alone. And you see, they very soon found themselves drawn into something. Had totally lost their focus on God, had totally lost their focus on their calling and on the opportunity to inherit the promised land. Their focus very quickly came down to one thing, and that was committing immorality with these Midianite women. So, again, Paul stresses back in 1 Corinthians 10, don't commit fornication like some of them committed. 23,000 died in a day. Reflects God's perspective. You see, through the lust, through the desire to satiate the physical appetite, some lost their focus and went astray. Others were enticed by the idolatry, and others enticed by immorality, by fornication. Now, Numbers 21 discusses the fourth category. It's a story involving the fourth category. You see, Paul also said in 1 Corinthians 10, neither tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. Now, and God sent fiery serpents among them. Now, what is that? What does that mean? What does it mean to tempt Christ? Well, we find the story here in Numbers chapter 21. In verse 2, Israel vowed a vow unto the Eternal, and said, if you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, I'll destroy utterly their city. The Lord hearkened to the voice of Israel. He delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them in their cities, and he called the name of the place Hormah. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. So things, evidently, this was a difficult trek, this part of the journey. You ever noticed in the journey of life that some portions of the journey are more difficult than others? Sometimes you're going downhill and you sort of pick up a little speed, and all of a sudden you find yourself going uphill. And that's not nearly so much fun. And that's sort of the way it was. And they became discouraged because of the way. It was evidently difficult. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Said, why have you brought us up out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loathes this light bread. Well, we've had about all the manna we want. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. Much of the people of Israel died. Well, that got their attention. They came to Moses and said, we've sinned. We've spoken against the Lord. Paul summarizes this account. He says, neither tempt Christ as some of them tempted and were, smitten by fiery serpents. Well, this is the account of that. What does he mean they tempted Christ? Well, notice their attitude of disbelief. They disbelieved God. They doubted God. They doubted God's promises. They said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? So they're imputing false motives to God. They're doubting God's intentions. They're doubting His promises. They're doubting His word. That attitude of doubt and disbelief is equated to tempting God. An attitude of really doubting God's promises, of casting aspersions on God's intentions, God's motives, not believing God. And so they began to look around at the problems, they began to look around at the way, and they became very negative toward God and filled with an attitude of disbelief and of doubt. Disbelief and doubt leads into disobedience. There are places, again, that you can go in the Psalms where it describes some of that. Let's notice back in Psalm 78. Psalm 78. We are told in verse 11 that Israel forgot His works and His wonders that He had showed them. Marvelous things did He in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt in the field of Zoan. And He divided the sea, caused them to pass through, made the waters stand as a heap. In the daytime He led them with a cloud, and at night with a pillar of fire, clave the rocks in the wilderness, gave them drink out of the depths. Verse 17, they sinned yet more against Him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness, and they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust, and saying, they spoke against God, saying, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Ultimately, we're told, verse 22, because, verse 21, the Eternal heard this and was wroth. Fire was kindled against Jacob. Anger came up against Israel because they believed not in God and trusted not in His salvation. They tempted God. We're told in verse 40, how often did they provoke Him in the wilderness and grieve Him in the desert? Yes, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. Remembered not His hand nor the day that He delivered them from the enemy. We're told again in verse 56, they tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not His testimonies, turned back, dealt unfaithfully like their fathers, turned aside like a deceitful bow. You see, they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. How did they limit the Holy One of Israel? They limited Him through unbelief. The account is given in the Gospels when Christ came to Nazareth, where He had been brought up. And we're told that the people had a negative attitude, sort of made disparaging comments. And they said, well, where did, why, we know who you are. You're the carpenter's son. We know your parents, we know your brothers, we know your sisters. And we're told that Jesus could do no mighty work there. except he laid hands on a few sick people and healed. Now he said, why don't you do here what you did down in Jerusalem? Or done some of these surrounding towns. Why didn't he do it? Because they limited the Holy One of Israel through their unbelief. They doubted. They did not have an attitude of faith. You see, we're told by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, don't lose your focus as they did. See, they tempted the Holy One of Israel. They tempted Christ. They had this attitude of doubting the promises, doubting God's motives, doubting God's intentions, an attitude of absolute doubt toward God. They didn't believe God. They didn't take God's word. They said, well, we've been brought out here to just die in the wilderness. Of all the insults to God, you're insulting God's intentions and you're insulting God's power. We're brought out here to die in the wilderness. Is that what you were told in Egypt? No, you were told you were going to the promised land. Well, I think we're going to die out here in the wilderness. He just brought us out here to kill us. So when they said that, they were disparaging both the power of God and the motives of God. They had an attitude of testing God and doubting God. Now, the final category Paul mentions, the fifth category, he said, neither murmur you, as some of them murmur. Don't murmur like they murmur. Now, that story is told back in Numbers 13 and 14. In Numbers 13, you have the account of where the spies were selected to go into the promised land. And they came into the promised land, they spied out the land. There were 12 spies, one from every tribe. Moses learned a lesson from that, by the way. When you get to the end of the book 40 years later and he sent them in again, he only picked out 2 spies. He sort of narrowed things down. He realized that sometimes more is not better. But he sent in 12 spies, one from each tribe. And they came in to spy out the land, and then they went and they checked everything out. They were gone 40 days. And 40 days later, verse 25, they returned from searching the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron. This is verse 26 of Numbers 13. For all the congregation of Israel, they showed them the fruit of the land. And they said, we came to the land where you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey. This is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people that dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are walled and very great. We saw the children of Anak. Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. So they began to be very negative about the promise. Caleb stilled the people before Moses, and he said, let's go up at once and possess it. We're well able to overcome it. The men that went up with him said, oh no, we're not able to go up against that people. They're stronger than we are. They brought an evil report. And they said, why, the land will devour us. It eats up the inhabitants thereof. Well, verse 14, or chapter 14, verse 1, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, would God we had died in the land of Egypt. Would God we had died in the wilderness. Wherefore has the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey. Why, it'd be better to just go back to Egypt. Why, Pharaoh might take us back, give us our old jobs back, let us work in a brick factory. They said, I know what to do. Let's make a captain and we'll return to Egypt. We don't like the leaders God sent because they're not leading us the direction we wanted to go. We'll just elect our own. We'll make us a captain. We'll pick our own man as the leader, and he'll lead us the direction we want to go. See, that's one of the advantages of picking your own man. He leads you the direction you want to go, and if he doesn't lead you the direction you want to go, you vote him out and get another guy in. That was their solution. We will pick our own captain, and we'll just turn around and go back. They were murmuring against God. You see, their complaint was against God. They didn't like what God was doing. They were filled with doubt. So they decided that they would take matters into their own hands. Let's make a captain and return to Egypt. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces for all the assembly. You know, they went to God. They put it in God's hands and really asked God to fight the battle. And Joshua and Caleb spoke to the company of the children of Israel, and they said, look, the land is a great land, an exceeding good land. And if the Lord delight in us, verse 8, He'll bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Don't rebel against the eternal, and don't fear the people of the land. You know, the Lord is with us. Don't fear them. The congregation said, stone them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle before all the congregation of the children of Israel. You know, God stepped in to intervene. Now, as you come on through, you know, what we find, again, the story here, Israel murmured. They were complaining. They were griping. They were dissatisfied with what God had in mind. And they wanted to take over the control of their own destiny rather than trusting God and following His lead. Remember what we read in 1 Corinthians 10 when Paul started into this? He said, now, you know, these are people just like we are, and they were baptized, and they ate the spiritual food and drank the spiritual drink, and they drank of the rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. He said, you know, God wasn't pleased with most of them. These things were our examples. He said in verse 11, these things happened to them for types, and they're written down for our admonition. So here are types. He didn't just go through and record every problem that occurred in the wilderness. He recorded 5 specific situations that he said were types. And he said we're to learn lessons from those. What caused Israel to get derailed? What caused them to not inherit God's promises? What caused them to lose their focus? Well, first thing Paul mentions was lust. They became absolutely caught up, obsessed with the physical appetites and with getting what they wanted and what they wanted when they wanted. A materialistic, physically obsessed approach to life. Well, when you're obsessed with the physical and with the material and with satiating the physical appetite, you lose your focus on God. The next thing he said was idolatry. You began to turn aside from true worship, and you began to, it leads you astray. It leads you further and further away from God and the knowledge of the true God. The allure, the enticement of idolatry, of worshiping the seen instead of worshiping the invisible God who's our Creator. The third type of problem he mentioned was immorality and the corrupting influence of immorality. Then the fourth category he mentioned was an attitude of doubt and disbelief toward God, of tempting Christ. An attitude of disparaging God's motives and God's abilities, God's intentions. An attitude of disbelief and of doubt. And finally, the fifth type of problem that he mentioned was murmur. Griping and complaining because the people were self-willed. They wanted what they wanted, and if God wasn't going to lead them the way they wanted to go, they just elect their own leader and he'd lead them. Murmuring, complaining. Now, you know, in spite of all this, God continued to deal with these people. And there's a reason for that. There's something God had that they didn't have. Something God exemplified and something God perfectly personified that these people obviously didn't have very much of.
And yet if they had had it, they would have retained their focus. We see how they came to lose their focus. We see that the same type of problems, Paul said, these are types, and they're written down so that we can learn from them. So it's not just ancient history, it's lessons for each of us. They lost their focus because they got focused on these various types of problems. Now, in the book of Exodus chapter 15 and verse 13, here is a song that is celebrating the delivery of Israel from Egypt. And notice here in verse 11, who is like unto you, O eternal among the gods? Who is like unto you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? You stretch out your hand, your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You in your mercy have led forth your people, which you have redeemed. You've guided them in your strength unto your holy habitation. Now the word that's translated mercy here in verse 13 is a Hebrew word that is used extensively in the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew word chesed. If you wanted to spell it out in English, probably C-H-E-S-E-D would be as close as any. It is generally translated in the King James Bible as either mercy or as loving kindness. You look at some other translations, and it's rendered, I think in several of them, as steadfast love. It carries the concept of loyalty, going beyond just necessarily what we think of as loyalty. You know, in our English usage of the word, often loyalty refers to, an underling for the one above him, his loyalty. Actually, in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament, in the Bible, this term is more commonly used to refer to the attitude of the one who's above to the one who's below him. God here, we're told, possessed a quality of steadfast love. Loving kindness, yes. Mercy, yes. But those words alone fail to carry the concept of the Hebrew, which carries the connotation of something that is continuing, that is enduring. One of the translations renders it steadfast love. Loyalty is maybe a more succinct way of viewing it. You see, God in His steadfast love, God in His loyalty, led forth the people that He redeemed. You see, God was steadfast in His commitment. God made a commitment to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and based on that commitment and the fact of His steadfast love, God is not fickle. He's not on today and off tomorrow. He's not fickle. You know, we're told, speaking of God, James tells us, that with God there's no variableness, neither shadow of turning. If there's one thing about God you can count on, it's the fact that you can count on Him. There is a steadfast quality to His love. Steadfast love, loving kindness, loyalty. As you come on down, Exodus 34, just notice a few examples of this word. Exodus 34, verse 6. Verse 5 says, the Lord descended in a cloud, and He stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. This is before Moses. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed the eternal God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands. Now this word, again, chesed, translated mercy in verse 7, and it is translated goodness here in verse 6, keeping mercy, abundant in goodness and truth, abundant in His steadfast love, keeping steadfast love, keeping that loyalty. God was steadfast in His love. Back in the book of Numbers, chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. in verse 18, the eternal is long-suffering and of great mercy. Great steadfast love. Loving kindness, yes, but loving kindness that includes being steadfast, being loyal. He's of great loyalty, great steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. So, Moses said in verse 19, "Pardon, I beseech you, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your mercy, as you've forgiven this people from Egypt even until now." Forgive them according to the greatness of your mercy, the greatness of your steadfast love, your consistent, enduring, steadfast, loyal love and kindness. Well, we could go on. Let's just notice one other example. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Verse 7, "The Lord did not love you nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest. Because the Lord loved you, because he would keep the covenant that he'd sworn to your fathers. As the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, redeemed you out of the house of bondsmen, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Know therefore that the eternal, your God, he is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." He keeps covenant and mercy, keeps covenant and steadfast love. God keeps his agreements. He's loyal. He is steadfast in his love. You know, the ultimate evidence of the steadfastness, the consistency of God's love is when you go through and you read all of the story of the Old Testament, how Israel continually forsook God and went astray and sinned against the Holy One of Israel. They tempted him, they provoked him, they murmured. And you know what God's response was? John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Without him was not anything made that was made." You come on down to verse 14, and it says, "The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory." Come on down a little further. We're told that he came into his own, but his own received him not. You know, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Jesus Christ, the rock of Israel, was made flesh and dwelt among us, and he gave his life to redeem you and me, and to redeem all these people who departed from their covenant agreement with God. God was steadfast in his love. God was consistent. God was loyal. Israel did not return that same sort of steadfast love, that same sort of loyalty to God, because they lost their focus. They got focused off on all these other things. And their lust and their idolatry and their fornication and their doubt and disbelief, their murmuring and complaining. They got focused on the enticements of the world, and they got focused on the problems of the world. Because if you look at that list, the lust, the idolatry, the fornication, they're focused on the enticements, on material things, on the allure and attraction of worshiping God the way they chose and incorporating in all sorts of paganism, on immorality, the enticements of the world, or they got focused in on the problem. They were doubting and disbelieving because the way was different. They were murmuring and complaining because things weren't going the way they thought they ought to. So they got focused on either the enticements of the world or the problems they encountered. And their loyalty and steadfast devotion to God went down the tube in a hurry. God's steadfast devotion and loyalty to them didn't go down the tube in a hurry. If it did, you and I wouldn't be sitting here, would we? See, God was consistent. God could be counted on. They didn't show that steadfastness. They lost their focus. because of that they did not respond to that steadfast love, and they lost their focus. They got their focus on other things. Now let me give you in closing 3 keys to retaining our focus. It's easy to get focused on either enticement or problems. You know, God doesn't. See, God doesn't. God is steadfast in His commitment, in His loyalty, in His love. David was a man after God's own heart. And when you read the story back in 1 Samuel chapter 20, and then we're going to compare with an account in 2 Samuel 9. But in 1 Samuel 20, you have the story here, a story of David and Jonathan. Now, this word, hesed, is used in both of these accounts. David was an individual that understood what faithfulness, what steadfast love, what loyalty was all about. David was a remarkable man in that way. David was also a man after God's own heart. In 1 Samuel chapter 19, you read the story, David was on the run from Saul. He knew, he was convinced in his mind that Saul was out to get him. Now, he met with Jonathan, Saul's son, his friend. And he told Jonathan, he said, I'm scared to go back over there. I know your dad's out to kill me. And Jonathan said, oh, no, I don't think he'd want to do a thing like that. You know, surely not. He'd have told me if he were going to do that. And David said, no, he wouldn't. He knows you and I are friends, and he wouldn't tell you. And so they made an agreement that Jonathan was going to go back. David was going to stay hidden for a couple of days. And Jonathan was going to go back and sort of sound out his father and come back and let David know one way or the other. Now, David told, as you come on down through the story, that in verse 7, he said, in verse 6, he said, now if your father misses me, then you tell him that I asked permission to go to Bethlehem. And if he says, verse 7, it's well, then, if that's not a problem, then you'll know everything's okay. But if he gets real upset, if he gets mad about it, know that he had some evil intention. Therefore, verse 8, you shall deal kindly with your servant. Now, this is the same word, hesed. You saw it was translated mercy back earlier when relating to God's attitude toward us. This steadfast love, this loyalty. You shall deal kindly. You shall be steadfast in your love and kindness to me. Be loyal. Because we have an agreement. We have a covenant. Now, Jonathan told him, he said, look, if I find out evil is determined, I will tell it to you. And Jonathan comes on and asks him. He says, now look, he said, on down in verse 14, you shall not only, while yet I live, show me the kindness of the Lord, the loyalty, the steadfast kindness, that I die not, but also you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. Your steadfast love, your loyalty. David and Jonathan made a pledge of loyalty. Jonathan said, I'm loyal to you. I'll deal with you in a way that's loyal. We live in a world that doesn't place a lot of value on loyalty. So often employers are not loyal to their employees. Employees aren't loyal to their employer. Husbands and wives aren't loyal to one another. A lot of times friends aren't loyal. Every so often something comes out in the news and you have somebody who's maybe been in a high security clearance and they weren't loyal to their country. They were selling secrets to some other country. Lack of loyalty. Because you see, for so many, loyalty is a matter of convenience. I'll be loyal to you as long as it's convenient, as long as it's good for me. If it's to my benefit, sure. But what about being loyal when there's no seeming benefit? Well, we don't live in a world that places that sort of loyalty on or that sort of value on loyalty. In fact, they want to place, too many people want to place a price tag on everything. How much is it going to cost? And what am I going to get out of it? Well, Jonathan and David made a promise that he would not only be loyal to David or to Jonathan, but he would be loyal to his family. Now, years passed. Saul and Jonathan have died, and the account is given in 2 Samuel chapter 9. David is now king over all of Israel. In 2 Samuel 9, verse 1, David said, "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness, loyalty, steadfast love for Jonathan's sake?" There was an elderly servant from Saul's house, and that was brought to David's attention, and so he inquired and asked him who he was. The king said, "Well, look, since you've been associated with the family of Saul, and you've been a servant there for a long time, is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God unto him? That I can show steadfast love, that I can be loyal to?" And it turned out that Jonathan had a crippled son. He was grown by this time. And so David invited him there and showed great honor and respect for him. You see, David was steadfast in his loyalty. David valued loyalty. You know, it's interesting. You read earlier in the accounts, even with Saul. You remember some who came and bragged about, the man who came and bragged about having killed Saul? David didn't consider that a good thing at all. You know, who do you think you are? You lifted up your sword against the Lord's anointed. On the other hand, you read about this little village that years earlier, in the beginning of Saul's kingship, they had been threatened with a horrible fate. And Saul had gotten the army together and come down and delivered. And you know, regardless of what Saul did, those people retained a sense of loyalty, a sense of appreciation. You find out later when Saul was killed on the field of battle, and the Philistines had beheaded him and just sort of desecrated the body. You read that men from that village came down there, sneaked down there at night, and recovered the bodies of Saul and Jonathan. And David praised them because they were loyal. They had a sense of commitment. There was nothing they stood to gain out of it, but loyalty meant something to them. They valued that sense of faithfulness. You know, perhaps the most important, perhaps a very key thing, first key I want to give you, is we have to learn to value faithfulness, to value faithfulness, to value loyalty, to value that steadfast love and commitment. If you don't value something, you don't hold on to it. Israel did not value faithfulness. They did not value loyalty. They were fickle in their relationship with God. God, on the other hand, was constant and steadfast. You look at David and you look at the life of a man who was steadfast in his faithfulness, in his commitment. You and I will never retain our faithfulness, will never retain our focus unless we value faithfulness. To value that loyal, steadfast love. Valuing loyalty, valuing faithfulness, valuing that steadfast love. That's the first key. Second key, to be summarized very simply, keep your eyes on Christ. Matthew chapter 14 gives an account of the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus sent the disciples away in a boat and he told them he would dismiss the multitudes. Well, he did, went up into the mountain to pray, and finally it was the wee hours of the morning. This is in Matthew 14. We'll pick up the account on down about verse 24. A storm had come up on the sea, and they were crossing the sea, evidently the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus had been up in the mountain to pray, and it was the wee hours of the morning. He came down, and everything was deserted, and he started out walking across the sea, walking across the water toward the boat. And verse 24, we'll pick it up. The ship was now in the middle of the sea, tossed with waves. The wind was contrary. The fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled. They said, "It's a spirit." And they cried out for fear, scared them to death. Some sort of a spirit, an apparition, something is coming at us. What in the world is that? It was a frightening thing. On top of everything else, you're out here and the lightning is flashing and the waves are tossing a little boat back and forth, and you're scared you're going to drown. Next thing you know, you look up and you see it looks like somebody walking towards you. Well, they really thought they were going to die then. And Jesus spoke to them and he said, "Be of good cheer. It's I. Don't be afraid." And Peter answered and he said, "Well, Lord, if it's really you, then bid me to come and I'll come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Well, come on." And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Verse 30, but when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand, caught him, and said unto him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they came into the ship, the wind ceased, and those that were in the ship came and worshipped him and said, "Of a truth, you are the Son of God." Of course he could walk on the water. He made the water. Of course the storm still. That was the voice that said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now notice, Peter didn't have any problem walking on the water as long as he kept his eyes on Christ. But you see, when he got his eyes off Christ, he started looking over here, and here are the waves, and here's all this stuff. And immediately when he started looking around, he thought, "I can't do this. What am I doing? I can't walk on water." Well, sure enough, he couldn't. Now, it's easy to read that account and think, boy, old Peter didn't have much faith. But I'll tell you, Peter got further on the water than any of you or I. I've never walked on the water, not like Peter did. So Peter may not have had a whole lot of faith, but he had a little more than, at least for a little while, he had a little more than any of us have ever had. You see, Peter didn't have a problem until he got his eyes off Christ. When he got his eyes off Christ, what he saw was all the problems around him, and fear began to replace faith. When you and I get our eyes off Christ, then we start focusing on the around. We lose our focus on God and on His promises and on the reality of it. First key is value faithfulness. Second key is keep your eyes on Christ. Let's turn back to Ephesians 5 in verse 20. Let's just pick it up here in verse 17. Third key is very simple. Be thankful. Verse 17 says, "Wherefore be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things unto God and the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." Being thankful, being appreciative, counting your blessings. If Israel had spent more time giving thanks and less time looking around for the problems, they'd been in a whole lot better mood, a whole lot better attitude. They lost their focus because they weren't thankful. They lost their focus because they didn't value faithfulness and loyalty in the way that God did. They lost their focus because they didn't keep their eyes on Christ. They lost their focus because they weren't thankful. They weren't appreciative. Giving thanks always for all things unto God and the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Being thankful. Rehearsing the psalms. Singing. You know, Paul says in in the book of Colossians, chapter 2, verse 7, rooted and built up in Him, established in the faith, as you've been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. Being thankful. Israel of old did not evidence steadfast love, loyalty towards God. They became enticed by looking at the various allures of the flesh, and they were enticed by material things and a focus on the physical appetite.